Thank you, Milton, and thanks for staying exactly on time. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Doherty. She will also be moderating a government relations information session, but she's now going to present Communicating the Value of Innovation in a New Political Climate. Elizabeth coming down with her entourage.
Good morning, and thank you, Lauren. As Lauren said, my name is Elizabeth Doherty, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning representing both the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and the NAI Board of Directors. My panelists and I are eager to set the conference tone as panel number one and think we will do so with a robust discussion on communicating the value of innovation in this political climate. Our panelists this morning are well-versed and positioned to do so, given their respective expertise and experience. On our panel, beginning on the left, we have Dana Colarulli, Director of the USPTO's Office of Government Affairs. To his left, we have Robert Duncan, Vice President for Strategic Research Initiatives at Texas Tech University. To Robert's left, we have Jessica Sibiak, Associate Vice President for Policy for the Association of American Universities. And last but not least, we have Mike Waring, Executive Director of Federal Relations for the University of Michigan. As we find ourselves in a world where politics is anything but business as usual, lines of priorities are being redrawn, and facts are often in dispute. Where do we find ourselves as individuals, as academic institutions, and as an organization as we face the challenges and opportunities of making America the country we know it can be, while not losing our identity as a nation of inventors and innovators? We have creatively and adeptly renamed our panel this morning as The Lion in the Path, and hope that you will enjoy and be a part of this discussion. Will we be the lion's lunch or the lion tamer? Good morning, panel.
Good morning.
Shall we begin? I'd like to turn first to Jessica and Dana, and of course, the remainder of our panelists as well, to start by describing the current legislative environment, including but also outside of the intellectual property landscape. What do our attendees need to know about the temperature and temperament of Capitol Hill?
I'm not sure if I'm...
Run for your lives now.
I'm going to let Jess start with that.
And I should explain very, very quickly that the title of our presentation comes from former AEU President Hunter Rawlings, who, when he was an undergraduate, was told by a professor of his that someday he would need to give a presentation. And he should consider titling it The Lion in the Path, because it sounded challenging and interesting, but it was pretty meaningless, and so could, stand in for anything. And so we at AEU have taken to using that title for pretty much everything. So it's a little bit Rorschach, you can mean whatever you want it to. So I thought I would start by doing a little stage setting and explain some of the, as you mentioned, the climate, the political climate in which questions about innovation and R&D funding are taking place in Washington. And say we are facing a very polarized environment, increasingly polarized political parties. There are very few swing districts remaining in the United States, and Americans are tending to identify themselves as consistently liberal or consistently conservative. And this sort of a political mitosis that's been happening, and you can see over the past 20, 30 years, people have pulled apart noticeably. And this has led to quite a bit of legislative gridlock in Washington. Another issue that we're facing now, I would say as well, also has to do with political polarization to some extent, is that we're seeing very few political appointees out of the president's office for key positions. And this is also, at least on the executive side, causing some lacuna, some gaps in agency staffing. As of March 31st, President Trump needed to fill nearly 2,000 appointments. And he needs to fill 46 science and technology positions that require Senate confirmation, and so far he has only nominated one for the head of the FDA. He has not said if he'll even keep the job of the presidential science advisor. And he's yet to fill the positions of OSTP director, NIST director, NOAA administrator, NASA administrator, so key positions. And so keep in mind that any legislative wrangling over budgets and caps and so forth will take place without a lot of the sort of core expertise that comes from these political appointees. And so, again, there's a bit of a gap there, and this is where, again, we need all of you and others hopefully can step up and offer your knowledge and expertise to the Hill. And we think that this empty appointments pipeline, combined with the hiring freeze that's happened, which I'll touch on a little bit, is being done purposefully. It's not; they're not just moving too slowly, but it is actually kind of philosophical desire to shrink the government. So that is another thing to keep in mind as we move forward. At this time, scientists, of course, have a lot of concerns, immediate concerns about the fate of their research budgets, because every agency is under the spending freeze, the continuing resolution that took effect last fall after Congress failed to pass a budget for 2017, also in part due to polarization and gridlock. And now we're facing President Trump's proposed skinny budget, as he calls it. So I should explain that under the Budget Control Act of 2011, discretionary spending on defense and domestic programs is capped. And related to that, sequestration is the series of automatic cuts to discretionary spending that was adopted by Congress in 2011 as a way to force the passage of a long-term budget agreement. So in this context, President Trump's skinny budget proposes changes to discretionary spending caps in both fiscal 2017 and fiscal 2018. In addition, very recently, the administration also asked Congress to boost spending for defense and homeland security by $33 billion in FY17. And this would be paid for in part by cutting $18 billion from domestic programs. And so among the suggested cuts, which would be absorbed over the last 5 or so months of FY17, are $350 million from the National Science Foundation and $1.2 billion from the National Institutes of Health. Congressional appropriators say that they are going to turn down these requests for now, but the implications are deeply worrisome. And I should note that, of course, President Trump's plan, his skinny budget, the cuts that we saw to science were much deeper than expected. It was an 18% cut to NIH and a sort of vaguely sketched out reorganization of NIH, 5.6% cut to the Department of Energy, 31% cut to EPA, and their Office of R&D is cut in half. 16% cut to commerce, the NOAA research is cut in half, and the NIST Manufacturing Extension Partnership was zeroed out. And there was also a 0.8% cut to NASA. So these are pretty deep and painful cuts, as you can see. And so essentially his plan to end the budget caps on defense, that is, increase defense spending on the military, can create simultaneous downward pressure, political pressure on non-defense discretionary spending, including signaling R&D. It seems that research is very much an afterthought. That might be putting it charitably. In the first Trump budget, it suggests that he does not see science as any particular priority. Interestingly enough, NSF isn't mentioned in his skinny budget, and nor are the research portfolios of Department of Agriculture. So it was quite vague, and a lot of details remain to be explained down the road. This isn't a new phenomenon in a sense. This skinny budget is quite startling and stark compared to past budgets. But because of sequestration and the series of continuing resolutions, we have also seen over the past 10, 15, 20 years a growing innovation deficit in this country. President Trump's budget would essentially dramatically exacerbate and accelerate the innovation deficit. And the easiest way to describe the innovation deficit is to say it's a marked downward trajectory in non-defense discretionary R&D spending as a percentage of our gross domestic product. We're also seeing that we're losing ground relative to other countries, particularly in Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea. We're losing ground in a number of fronts. For example, our growth rate in the number of new patents is negative compared to Korea and China. That's from 2000 to 2013. This will all get worked out, presumably. Maybe I'm being too optimistic this spring. But again, we are optimistic, or at least hopeful, that Congress, both parties, will reject many of President Trump's proposals. They hold the power of the purse, and they also they like to control their fiefdoms on the various committees. And so I think there will be a reluctance to wholeheartedly embrace his proposals. So we're also seeing aspects of regulatory reform, a regulatory freeze, which would be a mandatory 60-day review of new and pending regulations by the new administration. Another executive order said 2 existing regulations must be repealed for every new rule. And there's, of course, as I mentioned before, the federal hiring freeze, and the plan here is probably to reduce government through attrition, although this will also have far-reaching impacts on retention and recruitment. And the last thing I would mention as well is that this is all, of course, taking place in an environment where there is a lot of politicization of science. I'm sure you're all familiar and heard many stories about this. But for us at the AAU and our universities, it's of grave concern that the chair of the House Science Committee is a confirmed climate change skeptic. There are a lot in Congress who are adamantly against anything related to, for example, stem cell or fetal tissue research. There is a lot of attention paid in sort of what they think of as jocular terms of sort of waste of grants. And so a number on the Hill have been collecting examples of grants from NIH and NSF and elsewhere that they think are wasteful because they are silly sounding science. And so, for example, Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, he puts out a waste book every so often. This year's, I believe, was called Porkymon Go. So for any of you who have children or grandchildren who are into Pokemon, this is a way you can talk to them about your work. But these, I would say, largely focus on the social sciences. There are some that focus on the hard sciences. For example, there was a study done, funded by the government, shrimp on a treadmill, which sounds silly, but AAU's Golden Goose Awards gave the inventor or the PIs on this study an award because it actually did have very important findings with respect to aeration in the Gulf, and so it sounds silly to the casual observer, but it's not. So I think that's also something to think about is when we're seeing this divide on many in the Hill that between those who are willing to look at certain grant titles and just automatically assume that they are meaningless or wasteful because they have certain titles.
Dana, Jessica has certainly painted a very dire picture. Do we have any light at the end of the tunnel? Yeah. Are there some opportunities to be had here? How do you see the landscape? Is it a complement to what Jessica shared, or do you have similar concerns?
Well, I like the idea that I'm giving some hope to the IP system. So I can certainly give the view from the patent office's perspective, and it's a troubling time and it's a uncertain time. I think that's absolutely true, and you'll hear, I think, actually from all of us, I think we'll be in agreement that it's why having an active discussion that's based in reality and not fears, not concerns, about the role of invention, the role certainly of the IP system, and building the pipeline. of inventions and things that might eventually make it to the marketplace, but are too risky in the first place to even invest in. So I hope we'll talk more about that, and I'll certainly talk about that. I like the idea that we're defining a theme, by the way. So we'll look to, I don't know, Jessica, if the administration is actually the lion in the path here. I think we can redefine it a couple different ways. I'm going to talk about how we get the lion in the path in the first place to actually move us forward. That'll be my vision for how we tell the story. But I think as Jessica reflected, this is a transition. Transitions certainly are messy. It is, frankly, a little unclear how some of the actions of the administration are going to affect the PTO in the long term. But in the process, we're continuing to run the operations. Majority of what you all want us to do is to continue to look at applications, continue to look at the prior art, and simply act in a timely way and in a way that's high quality. We're doing exactly that. I was joking over dinner last night that we benefit from the fact that the PTO is there's a body of water, the Potomac. We're just on the other side of that from Capitol Hill. That allows us to be a bit independent and simply look and do our job. We're doing just that. But I think IP also benefits traditionally from bipartisan support. Certainly. Both sides of the Hill have said we should support inventors. We should invest in the IP system. Now, the question is how we encourage them to do so. And I think a lot of the initial actions of the administration might certainly are not answered. And I think we should drive to try to get some answers. I think. What else? I was going to say, I think IP benefits. I think PTO also benefits, by the way. Within the new administration, the focus certainly has been on issues unrelated to the PTO and operations, and largely unrelated to IP issues. Both the Hill and the White House are focused on a number of other issues, not least of which is setting up the government and filling a number of positions, but also addressing other issues unrelated to our environment. I think PTO has generally benefited from the fact that it is run more like a corporation. We're a 100% fee-funded organization. So out of the gate, the efficiencies that we internally have had to have the discipline to make sure that we're running a tight operation using our fees in a way that's responsive to what our stakeholder community wants. And managing within our budget. All of those things that are things that resonate with the current administration. And we're trying to talk about our business plan, make sure that at least our operations go interrupted. So I'm going to stop. I think there is, as I hope you get from what I'm starting with, there certainly is some hope and some good arguments about why what we do is so important. But critical, again, to all of that is to make sure that as the new administration tries to decide what it wants to focus on, is that there's an active discussion on why the work that all of you do is so important.
Thank you. Given our present discussion and the current environment of the administration, whether that's apparent or perceived, how would any of our panelists frame the issues of innovation from a university perspective? Are things remarkably different from the previous administration? And if so, how? And how do you respond to those differences?
Well, let me jump in here as a representative of a university to say that I think the job that we have doesn't change. We have to deal with the circumstances that we have before us. Whoever had won the election, we would be dealing with those folks. And so I think it maybe changes the way in which we talk about what we do, but what we do isn't going to change. If you think about the election, jobs was a huge issue. The more we can show that innovation creates jobs, the more we're going to be able to generate support for what the kind of activities we're involved in. So I think that is, while the players may be different, and we don't have some of the players yet chosen, I do think that the notion that what we do serves the economy, serves the nation's health care, serves the nation's national defense, those issues still resonate with people, and the more that we can address those and show how what we do it advances the interests of the country on all of those levels is very important. Particularly, the issue is about what's going to be the role of government in this activity. I think that's where this struggle is going to be. between the parties is how much, as it always is, what should be the role of government in this operation? And I think we just need to be really focused on what we do as innovators and as creating policies and creating products and innovations and discoveries that are going to lead to people's lives being better, the economy being better, protecting our country better, all those sorts of things. So it really goes back to the basics. I think we really need to get down to the basics and what we're doing and how we're talking about that. And I think the more we can show the job connection, the more we can show the innovation. And I think, given the concerns around the world, if we have a more protectionist view, if the administration has a more protectionist view, I think it's important to point out that we need to, if we're going to stay ahead of other countries, if there's concerns about other countries, this is the time to talk about how innovation keeps us ahead of other countries, and that most of the drugs that are created in the United States, that the leading innovations in the world come from the United States. And I think that's really important, and we need to remind people about that. They sort of take all these things for granted. I haven't run into any congressman who says, I don't like science. They all love science. They don't understand science, but they all love it. But we just need to throw and personalize what we're doing. And so they have a physical understanding. They see people doing these things. They meet startups. They're talking to people in their district who are talking about the work they're doing to reinforce that notion. I think that's really important.
It's interesting in this theme of the tiger in the path. I think the tiger may be similar to tigers in the past, but the path has changed very dramatically. And when most of us in the room graduated, I know when I graduated from MIT in 1982, Bell Labs was doing $1 billion of basic research. So the very early phase discovery, the very early phase capture of intellectual property that was so essential to the rapid advance of the United States was really something industry was bearing the expense of. But today that's not true. Today industry has outsourced that to universities. And so, as Jessica mentioned, as we've heard about these big cuts that are proposed in federal funding agencies, I hope that's not seen by the tiger as something in isolation just to save a little money, because that can upset the entire apple cart. This can change really what we've evolved into, which is industry really depends on this early phase innovation, and more than they ever have before at universities. And so if all of a sudden the number of universities doing cutting-edge research shrinks because of a reduction, say, in indirects allowed through the NIH to make a skinny budget, then the impact of that, sure, we'll feel it, it'll be painful at universities, but the much greater societal problem will be that will interrupt the innovation change that leads to us staying so competitive in the world markets. And I think that's what I hope we can really stress, that the path has changed dramatically from when, say, many people in Congress and in the agencies were graduating from school. It's now a very different story where university innovation is absolutely paramount to our progression. And if we nip that in the bud, we're going to really regret it.
Thank you. How can, and you've each touched on it slightly in your opening remarks and addressing the first two questions that we've taken. Do you have a specific call or a specific reach for each member here and the NAI organization as a whole as to how to best communicate the value of innovation from their different perspectives and that of the voice of the academic community? Mike, you've suggested that our message hasn't changed, but that we need to direct it in a certain way.
I think that's right, and I think whatever government relations goal you're trying to achieve in Washington, the first rule, whoever you're working for, is to explain how your business works, because until people understand how your business works, they can't understand why you care about patents, why you care about other kinds of issues. So we all assume that members of Congress understand tech transfer, these lab ideas and patents and funding, and it turns into these great discoveries and commercialization and all that stuff. They don't. There's probably 5 members of Congress who really understand that. So you need to be, along with all of you at universities, somebody on your university plays the role that I play at Michigan, which is to be your federal relations person, whether it's an employee in most cases, or sometimes they hire a consultant, somebody in Washington who's looking out for your interests. That person is your storyteller. You need to arm that person with great stories of what's going on your campus, that person can take to Washington and sell to members of Congress. Even better, get your member of Congress or senator to come visit your campus and see people doing this work, see startup companies, see students who are engaged in all this. We were talking last night at dinner about anecdotes. Members of Congress live on anecdotes. I've been to 150 or 200 or more hearings, and you'll hear members of Congress say, you know, I was in the district last week and I saw Fred Smith and he showed me blah, blah, blah. Fred Smith has now become the way that member of Congress views an issue because he's got an anecdote of something he saw in his district. Okay, so how do we become the anecdote for tech transfer? How do we become the anecdote for innovation in our congressman's mind? Because we get him there, he sees people, he sees students, he sees spin-offs, he sees the value of innovation, and now he has a framework, or she has a framework in which to understand this issue. And it's not just money on a page, it's jobs, it's people doing things exciting in your district. So the more we can do that. So think of your federal relations officers as your counsel, and you're the expert witness. Let them have you tell your story so we can get those stories out. The more stories we can tell in a positive way, the more we're going to get members of Congress to understand why, when they have a bad budget, they need to reject it, and why what you're doing is so important in the economy.
And I'll just add, what Mike's talking about is personalizing, personalizing the issue. There are members that absolutely, Mike, as you say, they say, oh yeah, invention, that's great. Science, that's great. But you want to bring it home, and where they may only generally understand the benefit and why it's an important thing, they do understand that they have a university in their district or in their state that's contributing to discussion, visibility of the state in investing in new types of sciences and technology. So if you can personalize it so that they can go to that hearing and say, well, look, I got a university in my state that's important to this. They're going to both reach out and say, why is it important to you? And they're going to be able to give you some of that visibility. And that's actually critical. I run a staff of about 10 folks. We sat down earlier this week and said, all right, Congress is going on recess next week. And then there's going to be at least 2 more times they go back to their districts and their home state in August for an extended period of time. What kind of information do we need to get to them on a whole host of things that are happening at the PTO so that they can understand what we do and what we bring actually to the local area? Same thing certainly goes for universities. Think about the opportunities that are coming up. Think about when they're on the ground in your state and invite them to come over, because that experience is something that's going to stick with them. So I absolutely agree with you, Mike.
While we're on this specific call to action, I want to be sure and have time to turn to Rob and ask the pointed question about how do you think the work towards securing an NAI congressional charter can help benefit this effort?
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth. That's a critical issue, and there's been an effort now for at least 2 to 3 years to secure a federal charter for the National Academy of Inventors. And I think this is really of paramount importance right now because of the situation we're in. It's important for us as a nonprofit organization, a non-government entity, to be recognized this way by the federal government, so we're seen as the resource, which we are, when issues of intellectual property, when issues of inventorship or innovation and entrepreneurialism come before the national agenda, be that Congress or be it agencies that would like a systematic study and report on these issues. So I think by the charter we'll be seen as that source of a collective professional authority, which we certainly are. I would also mention, just kind of, I think this dovetails really well in with the prior discussion, because of these shifts of early phase innovation to universities from industry, many industries have formed public-private partnerships with universities for either, say, early phase drug discovery or possibly in agriculture. I know at Texas Tech University we have a $55 million public-private partnership with Bayer Crop Science, primarily in cotton, but also in plant science and soil sciences more generally. And so one thing that I think is very important is when that contingent, the industrial component, comes forward and talks about the essential nature of early phase research in universities. It's always better in Washington if someone else, independent of you, is talking about the importance of your position in the overall sequence of things that really lead to the excellent technology-based economy that we have in the United States today. So getting your public-private partnerships to really start to advance the need for this sort of a public charter, so it's understood that the importance of the NIA is as it is. And I just pulled up a couple figures that you can find in the annual report on the NAI website, but it's remarkable. I mean, I think people have no real understanding that the NAI fellows have over 8,500 licensed technologies, have created over $100 billion in revenue from their intellectual property, created over 1.1 million jobs, and that's going to resonate very strongly with government, created about 8,500 companies, employed 18,000 students in the pursuit, and secured over 21,000 patents. So, I mean, the importance of this early phase discovery to prime this innovation that keeps us competitive is critically important. I go back to Norm Augustine, and Norm Augustine co-chaired this program called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and the Gathering Storm 5 years hence quickly approaching Category 5. All these things were universally agreed throughout Congress as being exceptionally important. And authorization, no problem at all. Appropriation, not a penny. So I think the thing that we really have to come back to again is the actual essence of our early phase innovation and discovery in this overall ecosystem that runs this innovation engine that has made us downstream in our major corporations so competitive worldwide. And I think that's the thing that a charter would also recognize. It would give us a opportunity to make that point publicly very, very well. And just like when the National Academy of Sciences was provided a charter, they quickly established the need for expert review on critical issues that Congress and the agencies could request. The same thing for the National Academy of Inventors in our space. The translational research is critically important, and by getting that emphasis, we're not saying it's not important to do basic research. Certainly, my whole career has been primarily in basic research. I see the need for that very, very well, and I think all of the universities in the United States understand that. What we're saying now is it's urgently important to get the translational research component going very strongly, and the charter would help with that.
Liz, can I continue to add to my, is there a shimmer of hope and light on the side?
Please do so.
And
it's always welcome.
I think the charter could be an excellent tool in this. Jess had mentioned the president came out with their skinny budget. Well, every president comes out, the Obama administration did as well. It's an early indication of what they're going to come out in their detailed plans. The detailed plans, we're still going to see. We're going to see in May. And then absolutely, Congress is going to take that up, and they're going to consider a number of the cuts or changes that are in there. I think we're at an important time right now where there is an opportunity to make sure that we're having a very transparent discussion about what's important to invest in and how we're spending federal dollars. So, we've talked about trying to make sure that folks are getting there and putting a face on what the role that universities are playing. I think certainly that's important when they're thinking about how universities are funding and where that funding is coming from. So I think there's lots of opportunity over the next year or so to make that argument. And we're just at the beginning of a conversation. So the charter and being engaged is very important.
Excellent. So
I was just going to add
Jessica,
one
please.
potentially cautionary note in sort of the finding the right equilibrium when you're having these conversations or having conversations about what the right equilibrium is between federal funding and private funding, because there seems to be an undercurrent of thought in the skinny budget that suggests you should just leave funding to the private sector entirely and let them, the market will sort it out. And I think making it very clear that it really does have to be a public-private partnership and that the two work hand in hand. And that is where the best R&D kind of happens. That's where the magic happens. And that one role the government can play is in not just sort of, again, increasing funding directly to grants and so forth, but creating tax credits or emphasizing the importance of intellectual property protections, things that really do incentivize the creation of public-private partnerships. But again, the emphasis has to be on public-private. It can't just be one without the other.
Very good cautionary note. So that we don't overstay our welcome, I want to be sure and look to my host, Lauren, to see if we have enough time for one more question. Okay, good. We also want to allow time for questions from the audience, if there are any. I am going to ask the question that may be on a number of people's minds, and something that regularly comes up with Congress, and that is the topic of patent reform. Do we think there is any need for patent reform? And if so, what types, and addressing what issues to protect America's inventors and innovators?
So I can start and then open to other kind of views. The last couple of Congresses have had an active discussion about comprehensive reform on a number of issues to try to limit the opportunities for abuse. It really is a continuation of a discussion that led up to the AIA, the American Invents Act, that focused on a number of reforms at the agency, very important reforms, but some, during even that process, advocated for changes in the court addressing the so-called patent troll problem. I think that continued the last couple of Congresses. There's a lot of momentum within Congress to continue to do something. All the meanwhile, they've been having the conversation. The court has acted on its own initiative to make some changes to rules, particularly around pleading. Discovery has become a little bit more certain. A lot of local jurisdictions have adopted model rules to try to at least manage the process of discovery to make it a little bit more certain. So at the beginning of a trial, you have a better sense of what you're in for. Certainly not 100% certain, but that's improved. So a lot of changes have happened in the marketplace that have reduced at least the major opportunities for abuse in the system. I didn't mention, but I should, in the American Invents Act, the creation of the post-grant review trials at the PTO, also kind of as a buffer, as a quality check, less expensive, hopefully, than district court litigation. I think that there's still a lot of momentum, at least politically momentum, within Congress to do something. I'm happy to see that I think Congress itself is saying the Supreme Court is looking at issues like venue. An issue that most folks can agree with. Having one location in the country where the majority of nearly 50%, 40 to 50% of all new patent litigation cases start in one jurisdiction in the country probably isn't good for the system. So at least addressing venue, the TC Heartland case is up in front of the Supreme Court right now. I think Congress is going to wait. They're going to look to see what happens there and then consider whether maybe not a comprehensive approach to reform, but a more narrow on this issue, maybe a few others, is the right way to go.
Yeah, and I also think that universities, through our associations, but working with a broader coalition in Washington, have done a much better job the last 3 or 4 years of really explaining the concerns we had about this larger view of patent reform, which would have really gone to the very heart of the ability of a patentee to defend his or her patent if it ever went to court, and the risks one would run if you got into that situation. And I think that broader effort of explaining this process, explaining how this whole process works from lab to the marketplace, we've done a much better job. We have many more members who now understand concerns about that, and I think that's been very helpful. We need to build on that now. I do think that if there's going to be changes, that they're going to be small. I also think, as we were talking before, that at some point Congress is going to say, you know, we've had AIA, that took 3 Congresses to pass. We've had 2 more Congresses dealing with reform that didn't really happen. We have another Congress now where the temperature has been turned down. At some point, people are going to say, enough about patents, let's talk about something else, and maybe we'll just move on. So there's some sense that we're going to have at least a chance for a lot of these changes to sink in. I mean, some of the impacts of AIA are just now being felt in the last year or so. Okay. So to go back and make further changes really becomes very problematic for people who are in this space. So I just think that we need to continue to push forward. But I think, again, going back to explaining how the process works and why patents are important is really important for all of us to do so that they understand why we get concerned when it's harder to defend a patent.
Because we're just about out of time, I would like to put out a call to see if there's any questions from the audience for these well-versed and expert panelists. Please, the gentleman in the center.
Yeah, a question and a comment, or a comment and a question. We have heard time and again during the elections, as well as we continue to hear after the elections, about the loss of the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector has moved away from the US, and much of it is going to be irreversible. So now we are talking about huge budget cuts which is going to impact our ability to innovate. So is there some way NAI can provide facts and figures, what it would mean in terms of cutting budget that really basically takes away our ability to innovate, what it might mean not for the 10 years, 20 years, what it might mean for the next 100 years. I think those facts and figures might go a long way in telling the legislators this mistake is bad and this mistake would be irreversible.
I think part of the problem is because science is long-term, has long-term views, and politicians have very short-term. I mean, they're worried about what they're going to get done this month, let alone worrying about things in the future. So I think part of our problem is sort of structural. The things that affect science, that science does, are over a long period of time, and they have an impact over a long period of time. But Congress's focus is so short-term that it's hard to get people's attention. A lot of members of Congress like science, they like NIH, they like these programs. But if you also talk to them, they also like veterans. They also like farm programs. And so when they are presented with how there are constituencies for all those programs with legitimate requests for funding. So how do they balance all of those things when they're being asked by different groups that they talk to all the time about, don't cut us, don't cut us, don't cut us, and that puts the people in a real box. So I think that's why it's even more important that we get to them on the very ground floor. And as far as manufacturing is concerned, that is tricky. And in fact, there's been a number of stories now that talk about the issue that, this sort of robots, the whole thing about automation, and maybe AI is going to have a huge impact on our manufacturing in the future, and in fact, a lot of jobs. So I think coming up with answers on some of those things is going to be very important for us to think about collectively as we sort of talk about where we're going in the future on these things. It's going to fundamentally change our economy. It already has, and it's going to continue to do so.
And Kitesh, thanks so much. That's a very insightful question and really a critical one, too. Certainly, I think that this loss of manufacturing jobs is a big concern. Certainly in the last 5-6 years, you've seen the Department of Energy and other agencies, Department of Commerce, with these new advanced manufacturing initiatives and big opportunities for, again, public-private partnerships funded by those between universities and corporations. And that certainly, I think, is one very important approach. But I don't think I'm beeping, but I'll check my
I regret that I think that's the indicator that we're out of time. But please finish your comment, Rob.
It's
okay.
like the music that rolls at the words.
I see. But I think the thing is that the number one thing to understand is that there's no way to regulate your way out of our problem in terms of losing manufacturing jobs worldwide. If we do our job well, we'll be able to incorporate, again, a partnership on a more global basis to make sure that doesn't limit innovation here. And I think that the thing that I like to try to stress sometimes when I talk to public officials is that there's no way to regulate your way out of these problems. You've got to innovate your way out of these problems. And so, again, invest in your inventive, innovative base, because if you don't, then the opportunity of kind of the knee-jerk reaction of regulation will not get you there.
We were going to wrap up here?
We are.
I just want to say, how many people here know who does federal relations at their university? Good. So go volunteer. Say to that person, if you need me, I'm ready to help you make our case in Washington with our federal.
It's an informed group, Mike. That's good.
I know. That's very good. Very impressive. Good job.
I see we have a gentleman in the aisle. I'm going to have to look to our host, Lauren, to see if we have the ability to take that question. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I think we don't, but our panelists, I'm sure, would be happy to have an offline discussion immediately following the panel. Thank you to the NAI for inviting this illustrious group of individuals to share their expertise and experience. Please help me in thanking Dana, Robert, Jessica, and Michael for being with us today.